Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming to join us at this advocacy mission this morning. But why we're here, I have a huge regard for Turkey and the Turkish people, but I'm not Turkish. Today, we're part of a global community. We've got to come together and keep up the pressure to stop and reverse the systematic eradication of the fabric of a democratic society. Here in Geneva, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights highlighted in a recent report on Turkey a constantly deteriorating human rights situation made worse by the erosion of the rule of law. Within this document, they went on to describe interference with the work of the judiciary, arbitrary mass dismissals, arbitrary closure of civil society organisations, arbitrary detention of people arrested under state of emergency measures, the use of torture, ill treatment during pre-trial detention, restrictions to the rights of freedom of expression, and still nothing changes. So today we've come together and gathered the most incredible group of speakers to have the debate, but more importantly to look for solutions, to look where we can start to help Turkey to become the free democracy that it should be and can be. The International Observatory of Human Rights is based in London, and we stand up for those suffering oppression and suffering human rights violations. We're independent, we're not aligned, and we're not political. We use our voice to advocate through these events, through social media. We're filming today for our IOHR TV, and we want to take this message to a much wider audience. This is a very important debate, and it shouldn't ever be silenced. We stand in a state of emergency, and it seems very fitting that in this very prestigious venue of the Swiss Press Club, that our first panel is called Silencing the Press. We want to address press freedom, which is the foundation stone of a healthy society. Turkey's the world's biggest jailer of journalists. It's ranked 157 out of 180 countries in the World Press Freedom Index this year. The new normal to silence the press is by shutting down media outlets, imprisoning over 239 journalists. I heard the new number this morning, which sadly doesn't ever seem to go down, and give them long jail sentences without any ability to appeal. We have a special interview, and you'll hear firsthand from award-winning journalist Lindsay Snell, who was not only imprisoned in Syria, but then detained and imprisoned in Turkey. And she has a very interesting story. On this, the UNESCO International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, we reflect on the death of over 1,000 journalists that have been killed reporting the news and bringing information to the public in the last 10 years. IOHR has condemned the brutal murder of one of their number, journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and we support calls for the UN to open the investigation and find those accountable. But more than that, to think about what this means, attacks on journalists simply for doing their job. The vocal response from the Turkish leadership to the fatal assault on this journalist seems at odds with the treatment of those journalists unjustly imprisoned today in Turkey. We can only hope that this new appreciation of safeguarding journalists is actually a new start, and that we hope to hear President Erdogan standing up for his own journalists and making sure that they're free. Our second panel, Prosecuting the Law, will focus on the plight of the judiciary, and in particular those who seek to defend individuals accused of terrorism offences or those arrested on the grounds of alleged affiliation to a terrorist organisation. Now, I'm not a terrorist, but through association of simply speaking on this platform and giving voice to opening the debate about focusing on the issues within Turkey, things like, exactly as we've heard from the UN human rights, we are at a time when to be called those who are here, some of them are Gulenists. We would be marked out as terrorists by association. Now, It's time Turkey rewrites its anti-terror laws in line with the Western democratic standards and reject this very vague definition of what accounts for a terrorist. It's time to free those imprisoned on guilt by association principles and membership of terrorist organizations, which is just a very vague way of saying that they stood up and spoke out and freely expressed themselves. It's a witch hunt that needs to stop. This is particularly prevalent in our third panel, which will address the eradication of civil society. Now, press freedom folds into that. So within press freedom, we'll also talk about civil society as well, because the two are completely interlinked. The education sector has been blighted by dismissals of teachers, academics, those accused of political links, and more than 22,000 workers have lost their jobs due to the closure of private institutions, foundations. Trade unions and media outlets have suffered the same fate. It's not good enough for us to reject over 27,000 applications of the European Court of Justice, deeming them inadmissible for failure to exhaust domestic remedies. It's time that we seek to establish a special commission that will work on the efficiency of the domestic remedies in Turkey and advise the international political institutions on the overall rule of law situation in Turkey. Things have to change. This is a time for us all to work for that change. I'm not calling for regime change, although some of the voices you may hear today may do that. That's their right to freely express their views. I'm calling for us as a global community to come together to find a path for the Turkish establishment to address this abuse of human rights, to stop destroying their society through the use of state emergency measures, and to return the follow due process and the rule of law. I'd like to thank you for coming to join us this morning. I'd like to ask you to participate and to share your views. And I'd also like to thank all of our speakers. I want to leave this stage knowing that by the end of the day we'll have some proper pathways. It isn't enough just to talk. It's more important that with this group of knowledge, with this group of people, that we truly come together and find a way forwards. And part of that is whether it's through petition, whether it's through the UN, whether it's through ideas that you may have, something has to give because we can't leave Turkey languishing in the situation it is today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I'd like to show you a very short video that we have from Luca Javier, and I'm looking at Tobias and hoping he can help me press the buttons here.
We need to turn down the lights.
We'll just turn down the lights. Thank you. I think while we're waiting for this, we'll move on. If I can introduce Trish Lynch, who is the moderator and our IOHR TV chief correspondent. Trish will be running the panels today, and she's going to introduce our first speaker. And
I don't know why it's not working.
Not to worry, we'll come back to our message from Luca. Trish, I'll pass over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's on. A warm welcome to all of you. As Valerie said, it's my pleasure to be your moderator today as we put Turkey under the spotlight and we look at what's happened to press freedom, to civil society and the judiciary since the failed military coup in 2016 and what has happened since that clampdown. Now, you will hear in all of our sessions that there is a lot of overlap because sometimes press freedom is almost the same thing as civil freedom. We're very, very lucky to have with us our keynote speaker today, who's going to set the scene and start today. How are we doing on the video? Is it? No, well, we may well come back to the video, but I think we should start with our keynote speaker. We're very lucky to have with us today Takis Hadjigeorgiou. He's a member of the European Parliament, Vice President, EP Delegation for Relations with Turkey Joint Parliamentary Committee. He recently tabled questions at the European Parliament on the subject of murdered journalists in Europe. He called for the need for increased protection for journalists and whistleblowers and is a leading voice in speaking out against oppression and free speech. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, Takis Hadjigeorgiou.
Now it's okay, I think. Well, let me first thank the organizers. I met the last 24 hours many very impressive people. Valerie, Lynch, Melissa, Margherita, Abdallah. And I think that for the rest of my life, I will take contact with them because we have to work, all of us together, if we really want to see a change, not only in Turkey, but in the surrounding area. I also want to extend a very warm welcome to the esteemed speakers and participants of this important event. Sometimes I cannot follow a speech from a politician when this politician has this speech in front of him in writing. But unfortunately, I am in this position today because many things have to be very specific. Dear friends, when things go wrong, we generally tend to talk about a crisis. However, the term crisis refers to an exemption, to a disturbing situation or disorder that will sooner or later return to regularity. The reality we live, it is not a crisis of human rights. Unfortunately, it is a new era. It almost feels like a permanent transition, one that we seem incapable of managing. It is a transition of global politics that moves away from democracy. The crisis in human rights is spreading everywhere. It has become globalized. From Turkey to the Middle East, from the sub-Saharan Africa to South America, to the Far East, to Europe and Central Asia. It is a world of change, but the traditional dilemmas about human rights remain and new challenges emerge. Our work on human rights is becoming increasingly complex. It requires new skills and know-how and a more committed and multifaceted strategy to effectively combat them. As Vice President of the EU-Turkey Joint Parliamentary Committee of the European Parliament, I have regular contacts with Turkish officials and diplomats and visit the country regularly. It is my firm conviction that Turkey's challenge is an existential one. It lies in its inability to change the way it perceives its own size and power. Many times in the past, I have written that the main problem for Turkey lies in its inability to perceive and manage its size. By this I mean understanding its spatial role in time and in history vis-à-vis its people, its neighbors, the EU, and the world overall. I am not confident that Turkey under Erdogan, unfortunately not only under Erdogan, is able or willing to take up this challenge. Instead, what do we see? We are witnessing a growing disrespect for human rights, hundreds of journalists imprisoned without a fair trial, free speech violations and failure to protect women, just to name a few. As a response to this situation, the European Parliament has kept a critical stance on Turkey's numerous violations, calling at times for the suspension of its accession process. Take the latest 2018 progress report on Turkey, for example. It identifies a series of shortcomings that pave the way for mainstreaming and exacerbating the violations of the rule of law and fundamental freedom in the country. I will make a note of the most serious ones that include, first, the serious backsliding on the freedom of expression, criminal cases against journalists, with hundreds of them still in detention, human rights defenders, writers, or social media users, withdrawal of press cards, as well as the closure of numerous media outlets, are a serious concern and are mostly based on selective and arbitrary application of the law, especially provisions on national security and the fight against terrorism. The internal law and the general legal framework continue to enable the executive to block online content without a court order or an inappropriately wide range of grounds. The increasing restrictions that were put in place on the rights of journalists and human rights defenders working on the Kurdish issue, the launching of smear campaigns on some media outlets against human rights defenders have become a recurrent feature. Similarly, the European Parliament resolution of 8 February 2018 on the current human rights situation in Turkey is also very critical of Turkey. The question that follows is how we can identify which options there are to move forwards to active outcomes. What can be the role of the European Union in this process? If history has shown us anything, it is that to solve great problems, you need great leadership and a determined people, both in Turkey and in Europe. At the same time, the resolution of a crisis or a problem depends on the role we assign for ourselves in managing the problem. Let us be blunt for a second. When Europe pretends that it's not seeing what is happening in Turkey, in Syria, in Iran, in Yemen, then it becomes part of the problem. While Europe is witnessing what is happening in these countries, it finds itself unable to act in a constructive and substantial manner as a global actor. This is due, unfortunately, to various factors. One of the most important is the European leaders' inability to put a common foreign and security policy firmly on the agenda. This inability hampers Europe's capacity to adjust in today's multipolar world increasingly ruled by power politics as a unified entity. 28 member states are unable to find a common line of action. Different and at times competing national foreign policies among member states have weakened Europe's international position. While the future of this transnational organization is at risk, it still continues to be a noble attempt to construct and share a common vision among Europeans, and not only among Europeans. Europe cannot regard violations of human rights as an ad hoc emergency challenge. This approach undermines its credibility and the extraterritorial impact and makes it extremely difficult to press other countries to respect human rights. I firmly believe that Turkey needs to demonstrate its strong willingness to build substantive and reliable relations with the European Union in order to mend the shattered bilateral ties. Unfortunately, currently, such a will seems to be absent. Although a lot of people disagree with President Trump's worldview, and I disagree with him fully, and his way of conducting politics, his heavy-handed approach with Turkey in its bid to secure the release of a detained US pastor has prompted many, myself included, to ponder whether Turkey means business only when under robust pressure. Nonetheless, I would like to close with a positive note. I sincerely believe that the European Union and Turkey can find a way forward if Turkey proves in actions and in an honest way that it is indeed seeking a tangible relationship with the European Union. Europe needs a democratic Turkey. Europe needs a country that respects the rule of law and strengthens democratic institutions for all its citizens, supporters, and opponents alike. A democratic Turkey that respects and cooperates with its neighbors. There is no other way. We need to intensify our efforts and, most importantly, be honest with both ourselves and with Turkey. We must not tolerate provocations against neighboring countries or the abuse of human rights. We are open to extensive cooperations once these parameters are met. We cannot have double standards, and certainly we must not sacrifice our values for the sake of trade and economic relations, which seems to be the priority for some big member states. See what is happening today. Many European leaders disagree with what goes on within Turkey, but still they have in mind their economical interest. Germany, for example, has thousands of enterprises within Turkey, a very big relationship between the two economies. So Mrs. Merkel cannot put pressure on Turkey, really. Although, if you will talk to her in private, she may say to you that she disagrees with us fully. But sometimes we politicians, we don't represent ourselves. We represent the chair on which we sit. So a politician can make the difference if he can break the chair on which he sits to say what exactly he thinks. Otherwise, things will go on as we know them till today. And I will not leave the podium if I don't refer to what Turkey is doing, not only within Turkey, against its own citizens, but I want to underline that Turkey is doing the same thing against the citizens of other countries. I come from Cyprus, and I want to say that even in Cyprus, Turkey is violating for 44 years now the rights of the Cypriots, and I'm referring to the Turkish and Greek Cypriots, because me as a Cypriot, I try, and it's not always very easy, to represent not only the Greek Cypriots, but the Turkish Cypriots alike. I am a Cypriot, so and I know that Turkey is doing that for many other countries in the neighboring area. So thank you very much. I'm really glad that I'm here, and I thank again the organizers for the invitation and for their great hospitality. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Takis Hadjigeorgiou there, setting the scene beautifully on the human rights violations that are currently affecting not just Turkey and its citizens, but those who are living overseas also. Now, sometimes when technology fails us, we throw our hands up and what can we do? But it seems that technology is on our side now. So we are now going to see the video statement by Luca Javier. He is the president of the European Economic and Social Committee. So let's have a look at this video.
Good morning. I am truly sorry not to be able to be with you for this seminar today that will discuss a topic close to my heart. As you know, in my previous life I was a journalist, and the situation of media freedom and fundamental rights in Turkey is of great concern. Last year, the European Economic and Social Committee has invited exiled Turkish journalist Can Dündar, and we had a similar debate in our plenary session. At the time, Can, in a very emotional speech, called on Europe not to leave Turkey alone. To the journalists in exile and families of imprisoned journalists present at your conference, I will say, we will not leave Turkey and Turks alone. I am pleased to say that the European Parliament, early this year, rang the alarm, as well on the current human rights situation in Turkey, and urged the Commission and HR Mogherini to raise with their Turkish interlocutors the situation of human rights defenders and to provide diplomatic and political support for them, including observation of trials and monitoring of cases. We all know too well that if journalists are silenced, so is democracy. Peace and stability of a country depend on democracy, the rule of law, the separation of power, and the army of journalists that every day defend our fundamental freedoms and the diversity of opinions. There is no doubt that in recent years there has been a delicate relationship between Europe and Turkey. But I would like to insist that our shared history has not always been based on conflict. We have also shared in artistic, scientific, trading and military ventures. I believe that today pro-democratic forces within Turkey and the EU have much to learn from one another, and that it is the role of civil society, academia and the media to keep open these avenues of communication and support. This is how we can help Turkey and the Turks today, not in one day, nor in 1 month, but patiently over time. Let us hope that today political trends in Turkey can change. For that, we all need to support the democratic aspiration of a huge part of Turkish society. We at the ESC are doing our best through a permanent dialogue with Turkish civil society organizations and also Turkish authorities. I can only reiterate that we need to keep open the channel of communication and dialogue. With that, let me send you my best wishes for a dynamic and fruitful conference. Thank you.
For his comments, saying that the European Parliament is committed to keeping helping Turkey to improve its human rights violations, bearing in mind that they have been close friends for many years in other times. We are now going to move on to the silencing of the press, and as I said earlier, there is an overlap with silencing of the press and civil society, as you will hear. We know that Turkey, as we've heard today, has been named as the worst jailer of journalists by CPJ in both 2016 and in 2017. They currently have, as Val said earlier, 239 journalists in custody, and another 143 are living in exile, frightened to come back to the country. Our panel today have been very personally affected by the media crackdown and are here to discuss why it's essential to insist that press freedom remains a priority, particularly when freedom of speech across the board is under threat, not just to the freedom of speech, but also to civil rights in general. I'd like to welcome our first speaker today, and that is Abdullah Bozkurt. He is a journalist and author of the book Turkey Interrupted, Derailing Democracy. Abdullah is a brave voice in the fight for press freedom. He was the bureau-in-chief for today's Zaman in Ankara and was founder and publisher of the Muhabar news agency when it was shut down by the Turkish government in July 2016. He left Turkey for Sweden and now lives as a political refugee in Stockholm, where he is also the president of the Stockholm Centre for Freedom. Please welcome Abdullah Bozkurt.
Well, thank you, Trish, for very nice words about me. Thank you for having me here for the International Observatory for Human Rights and the Geneva Press Club. And I also want to welcome for all the participants and the guests and the speakers and the listeners as well for showing interest to this very important event that will be highlighting not only crackdown on the press freedom, freedom of speech in Turkey, but on civil society, academia, educators, teachers, members of judiciary, from judges, prosecutors, and the lawyers. As Valerie mentioned in her introductory speech, she said, "I am not a terrorist, neither I am. But in the eyes of the Turkish government, I am a terrorist. And the way the Turkish government defines a terrorist, as Valerie briefly mentioned, anybody who came in a contact or associated with, affiliated with, you can add all kind of different phrase, they are also deemed to be terrorists. So with due diligence and the warning in advance, you are also a terrorist by just attending the conference here and listening me and others. That's why 239 journalists are languishing behind bars in Turkey today on completely fabricated terrorism charges, in most cases, and in some cases defamation charges, or insulting the Turkish state, this artificial identity of the Turkish state or government official, and in some cases espionage charges as well. But when you read the indictments, the prosecutors, the partisans, the loyalists filed against the reporters and the media workers, there is nothing that would suggest there is a criminal activity that these journalists has done in the past, or any arms, or anything that, for that matter, that may refer some kind of criminal activity in their past. The only evidence they have in those indictments are published articles. Sometimes it may go back 5 years, or commentaries they place on Twitter or other social media platforms. Sometimes not even the tweets they wrote, just for retweeting, for example, the main opposition party leader in Turkey, that was also included as a criminal evidence in the indictment against the journalists. When we first published the report, after we were forced to live in exile back in 2016, our first report in Stockholm Centre for Freedom was titled as far worse than you think on the press freedom woes in Turkey. The number at the time, it was 176, and today we have, as of yesterday, 239. That's unbelievable figure. And in the eyes of the Turkish government, all these guys are terrorists. And 148 journalists who are living in exile or living in large, they are also facing outstanding arrest warrant. Over 60 of them already convicted on these fabricated charges, but most of them are languishing behind Turkish prison bars in pre-trial detention, in many cases without knowing what kind of evidence, if any, the Turkish government has against them, or they cannot even find a lawyer. We're going to be discussing the crackdown on the rule of law in Turkey in the second session. Maybe we can touch on that by the speakers. it's very difficult if you are a critical journalist to find a lawyer to represent your cases. Because 700 lawyers in Turkey, some of them the heads of the bar associations, some of them professional organizations they led in the past, but they are behind bars because they represented either critics, human rights defenders, journalists as such, and they are behind bars, so it's very difficult to find a lawyer to represent your case, so you don't have, in many cases, access to the investigation file or the indictment. But the numbers is quite staggering in all the professions. Can you imagine a country where all the diplomatic force, 1/3 of them, are declared and branded as terrorists overnight? It's not just the journalists, by the way. That's what we have in Turkey. We have 1,200 diplomats, some ambassadors, some charge affairs, deputy chief of missions, and other titles. And overnight, the Turkish government branded 1/3 of them, including very high-profile ambassadors who served as an advisor in the past to the presidents and the prime minister, terrorists. They were immediately dismissed from their jobs without any legal investigation, without any administrative investigation at all. And some of them ended up behind bars. And the same story for the members of the judiciary. 1/3, 30% of all the members of the judiciary, prosecutors, judges, who were dismissed on completely baseless charges, and many of them were thrown into jail. But it's not a random case. Why the government is going after critical journalists or lawyers or prosecutors or any other, members of the society from different walks of life? First, they went after those who have been covering, for example, the corruption investigation back in December 2013, which incriminated President Erdogan family members personally. There were a lot of money being exchanged as a response to the favors from the government. And Erdogan was sitting at the center of this major corruption investigation. And the journalists and the media outlets who have covering this, they were the first targets. And that was long before the failed coup attempt. I think many people assume things started, July 2016 after the failed coup attempt, which is completely a false flag operation by Erdogan and his intelligence chief, just to set up the opposition for a mass persecution, because there is no real evidence, hard evidence to suggest that all these people were involved. Right after the failed coup attempt, you are dismissing and arresting thousands of the judges, prosecutors who actually investigated how the Turkish government aiding and abetting, especially Al-Qaeda groups, and in some cases Islamic State of Iraq and Levant as well. So it's not a random. They went after a specific group of the people, whether that will be in the media field or the judiciary field or other field. It was sort of a punishment for those who exposed the dirty laundry of the President Erdogan, his family members, business and political associates. That was the real story behind that. But the attack, as I said, came long before the failed coup attempt. In fact, actually, I just want to give you a panorama of what happened last week, a couple of names that I want to highlight, just to give a snapshot. A friend of mine, Alparslan Akkuş, he was the bureau chief for a critical daily Bugün in Ankara. He was indicted, and the prosecutor is asking 15 years jail time against this guy. He used to write for the Huffington Post. He was the chief editor of the Turkey edition of the New York Times when he was working for Sabah Daily, which is owned by the Erdogan family, by the way. So it was okay if you are working for pro-government or a media outlet that was controlled by Erdogan. But when he moved to other media outlet, which is very critical of the government at the time, then he became a target, and now charges filed against him just last week. And he has been working as a journalist for all of his life. He has a PhD on the journalism. He was an international visitor fellowship guy from the U.S. State Department. So he has all the credentials as a journalist. But in the eyes of the Turkish government, he is a terrorist. Another name I want to highlight is Ece Sevim Öztürk, very young lady. She has own website, editor-in-chief. She was looking into some of the allegation in what happened in the failed coup attempt on the night, where some of the people were accused as an assassination plot against President Erdogan. And she found a lot of inconsistencies just by looking to official documents that were in the court papers. When she started digging further, she was about to expose this false flag, and she was detained 5 months ago, formally charged and arrested, put a solitary confinement for 5 months. According to UN criteria, only 2 weeks allowed for any inmate to be in the solitary confinement, but she was in the solitary cell for 5 months, and last week there was a hearing into her case, and the court decided to keep her in jail. That's why there is no evidence, incriminating evidence against her. And the last one that I want to highlight is a Kurdish journalist, Mehmet Sarı, a Turkish national who was working in Turkey for a Kurdistan TV based in Erbil, just because he wrote critically of not the Turkish government, Iranian government. He used a bloody Iranian regime as a commentary when he was trying to make a case on the capital punishment. They hanged some of the critical Kurds in Iran, and because of that he is facing an indictment and the charges. So not just the Turkish government, but anybody that's aligned with the Turkish government, like the Iranian mullah regime, they are also being targeted in Turkey. Maybe we can go deeper in the Q&A session if we have time. But as I said, the numbers are quite dramatic, and the main motivation behind this, if you silence the critical, independent and opposition media, then it will become very easy to go after other institutions, civil society, because they will not find any venue to express themselves, to provide a different narrative to the Turkish public. Unfortunately, because of 180 media outlets that were shut down by the Turkish government, in addition to jailing hundreds of the journalists, Turkish people are hearing only one story today. And in many cases it's very hostile, very xenophobic, in many cases anti-Semitic as well. And they see all the neighbors of Turkey trying to attack dismember Turkey. Very nationalistic, very religious narrative which is being pumped up in the Turkish population, which will be very difficult to heal after this process over in Turkey. So that is the main motivation on the part of Erdogan government to keep attacking independent, critical and opposition journalists. They want to keep only one narrative, because if it exposed to the light of the facts, then they know it's gonna collapse like a house of cards. That's why they arrested this young lady who was digging into what happened on the failed coup attempt. So with that, I will close, and maybe we can expand further later on in Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you. Abdullah, if I can ask you just to join me here for a few moments, please. Thank you. Abdullah, just a few questions, and then we'll bring Annie up and we'll have a bit more of a panel discussion. Now, the day after you left, your offices were raided, and then a campaign of intimidation was targeted at your family, at your elderly mother, who was 79. Tell me how it felt to have this very personal attack on your freedoms.
First, I was shocked, of course. I was quite angry. And I understand the main motivation behind it. You may be out of Turkey, you may be living in Sweden, relatively safe, but they can come after you with everything they got. They can come after your family members just to try to silence you, even if you are not in jail. Then I decided, no, I'm not gonna give up. I'm gonna keep speaking up and writing on what I see the Erdogan government is doing in Turkey and in other parts of the world. That's how you fight back. Because if you become silent in the face of the threats, not just by threatening family members, they're also sending operatives across the world, following the critics, and as such, maybe we have some in this group of audience as well. They want you to be completely silent. If I do that, then they will win, and I don't want to do that. I'm going to keep speaking up and writing and exposing what Erdogan government is doing in Turkey and beyond.
I'm curious to talk about the prison system. Oh, sorry. There we go. Okay. The prison population has grown hugely over the past few years, and there was an amnesty recently where Erdogan allowed rapists and murderers to go free. 50,000 criminals were set free to make room in the prison for journalists, lawyers, human rights defenders, dual nationals and Turkish citizens. Do you think that we've seen the worst, or could there still be more to come?
I think the worst is yet to come. I think the initial signals, that was long before the failed coup attempt when Turkish government decided to set up new prisons. It was actually a question from the Council of Europe, a special committee, looking into this torture and abuse in the Turkish prisons. They did not understand why the Turkish government allocated so much money to build a new prisons. And the guys from the Turkish side is responding, we're going to have more inmates soon. And that was long before the failed coup attempt. So there was a preparatory stage. And even that was not enough. So they decided to grant an amnesty to rapists, murderers, and all kind of nasty people, and they let them go. And one of them, for example, just to give you an example, a very young guy who killed a Christian pastor, the Catholic pastor actually, in northern part of Turkey. There was hard evidence. He was convicted and serving time. And one of these 60,000 people, this young man. And as soon as he got out, he was giving interviews, nothing, regret at all. And all kind of this xenophobic, anti-Christian, anti-Western sentiment he was pumping through the interview. And another new bill is coming up in Turkey. They want to grant amnesty to organized crime syndicate and mafia members to make a space, as you said, for people who may be arrested in the future from different walks of life. It's a part of the intimidation campaign. They need to sustain this, otherwise they know it's going to collapse when it gets exposed and investigated further. And that's the main motivation why they have doing this all nasty stuff.
Thank you. There we go. Thank you for that. I'd now like to welcome Annie van Wiesel. She's a member of the EU-Turkey Joint Consultative Committee, a policy advisor, international affairs, FNV, Netherlands Trade Union Confederation, member of the Netherlands Workers Delegation to International Labour Conference, and advisor to the Netherlands Workers member of the ILO governing body. Please welcome Annie van Wiesel.
Thank you, Trish. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of the EESC. You've just seen the president of the EESC on the video making his statement. I am a member of the EU-Turkey Joint Consultative Committee, which in fact is, and I was the co-chair, but I'm still a member now, which is actually a committee under the EESC, or of the EESC, you could say, bringing together civil society organizations from the EU, members of the EESC, and from Turkey. It was established in 1995 to engage civil society organizations in both parts of the world in the process of accession. So this is maybe to position myself a little bit. In the EESC, so also in the EU-Turkey Joint Consultative Committee, you find employers associations, also trade unions. My background is a trade union background. It will show in my speech, I can tell you. But also women's organizations, organizations of people with disabilities, representing the wide variety of civil society organizations, both in the EU and in Turkey. The first time I became aware of a threat to the freedom of expression in Turkey was when a young woman, I think it's about 5 years ago, told me that her mother had warned her to be careful with her posts on Facebook. My initial thought was an overprotective mother, not quite familiar with social media. But this mother was right. And today we are facing unprecedented attacks on freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, on human rights, on civil rights. These attacks are suffocating civil society in Turkey. As I said, civil society organizations can be very diverse in objective, in subject, in method of working, in political tendency, if any, and in history. This diversity is reflected in the EU-Turkey Joint Consultative Committee of the EESC on both sides. The EU, so we find members of the Turkish Employers Association, the Chamber of Commerce, the organizations of small and medium enterprises, women entrepreneurs, several trade unions, and academics. However, a very important part of Turkish civil society is not represented. Those that we find most under attack now are outside the JCC for several reasons, several different reasons. The European members of the JCC follow a double-track approach. Some years ago, we started to have meetings with the organizations outside the JCC as well as inside. Last time we were in Turkey. We go to Turkey once a year. Civil society organizations from Turkey come to Europe once a year, so we see each other twice a year. Last time in February this year, we met with human rights defenders, Amnesty International, the Human Rights Association, with environmentalists, city developers, with trade unions in opposition, with professional organizations, and over the years, we met with lawyers, journalists, judges, doctors. We continue to have our official JCC meetings, in which the discussion on democratic freedoms and human rights is becoming more and more important. As European members in the JCC, and you've heard also the president of the EESC stressing this, we insist on defending these rights in the joint conclusions of the JCC that usually sum up the meetings and are sent to both the European Commission and the Turkish government as a common position of civil society in Turkey and Europe. We've seen the space to operate shrinking for all organizations, both inside and outside the JCC. We found a few years ago that our friends outside the JCC were facing charges of having insulted the government, or more specific, the president. Initially, it was taken lightly. There were jokes. Our partners within the JCC started to give different opinions in public from what they said in private. They deleted from their press statements the critical words we spoke on government policies. Today, there are no more jokes. There are no more press releases. Telephones are being tapped, computers and passports confiscated. The organizations we met in February have been witnessing frequent administrative and judicial investigations. We could no longer have joint conclusions from our last JCC meeting. Allow me to take the example of trade unions to show how the rights of civil society organizations are being restricted. But first, maybe I should explain to you why are trade unions such an important part of civil society. I am biased, of course, but in good company, because the OECD and the IMF acknowledged that trade unions and their collective bargaining are the main redistributive force in society. The curtailing of trade unions in law and practice explains why Turkey is among the most unequal societies within the OECD and why the minimum wage is so much lower than a living wage would be. Trade unions are also the guardians of occupational health and safety. Turkey is among the most dangerous countries in the OECD for workers, with construction and mining as particularly deadly. You may have been following the events at the new Istanbul airport, which is an example of a spontaneous protest strike. Working conditions are very bad and hazardous. At least 37 workers died, but workers on the spot say it's many more. When the strike actions were supported by Turkish trade unions, their leaders were arrested, and we are now campaigning for the release of Özgür Karabulut and 23 others who are still being detained, according to our information. Hundreds of workers have been dismissed for protesting. In the public sector, the trade union KESK finds its executive members in exile. One of their former presidents, for example, is in Switzerland, or in jail. Elif Kuhadar was arrested for a speech she made 4 years ago. 4,200 members of KESK have been dismissed in the wave of dismissals after the coup attempt in 2016. Thousands of teachers, in particular those who are organized in Egetimsen, have been dismissed with no possibility to practice their profession elsewhere. Egetimsen is trying to provide them with legal aid and a minimum income. But despite the support of the international trade union movement, there's a limit to what they can do. Their members are often too afraid to protest, as this may make their situation even worse. Trade unions need the freedom to criticize government and, for that matter, company policies if they harm the interest of their members. They should be able to demonstrate and organize meetings to raise these issues and engage the public in a debate. In the end, they should have the right to strike. None of this is currently the case in Turkey. In the private sector, an average protest or attempt to set up a union generally follows more or less the following pattern. The workers initiating the protest or organizing the union are being dismissed, even if this is in violation of the law and international standards. This generates protest by their colleagues, who are also dismissed. The dismissed workers, together with their union, organize a picket line in front of the factory. They face police harassment or even violence. The official press ignores or criminalizes them. They go to court, of course. But this may take 2 to 3 years. Usually the courts decide that the workers have to be reinstated. And very often this does not happen. I could give you examples from all sectors. Fortunately, it does not always end like this. Trade unions still organize and protest, like other civil society organizations still organize and protest, speak out. Trade unions sometimes win, in particular when they get the support from international unions organizing the same international, very often European, company. Though it's mainly on the agenda for the afternoon session, I do want to share with you some thoughts about what we can do. We can organize meetings like this, and we should. Continue to raise the examples, protect the victims, tell their stories. Stress that the current state of affairs in Turkey cannot be the new normal. Valerie also mentioned it. After the so-called lifting of the state in emergency, while all the rules and regulations are still in place. We can continue to use the international organizations and structures to defend human rights. The European Parliament, the European Commission, the ILO, the International Labour Organization. The rights of trade unions, for example, are protected under international law by international conventions of the ILO, some of which are also ratified by Turkey. To conclude, the JCC will continue to support civil society in Turkey. You've heard our president make the commitment. We will continue to defend the rights and the space for civil society to function without interference, oppression, or intimidation. We will continue to try to be the bridge between European and Turkish civil society. We will continue the dialogue with those who are intimidated. those who wish to avoid conflict with the government, but share the values of democracy and the rule of law. Those who say, help us survive, this will pass. And above all, the JCC will continue to support the courageous people in Turkey who, despite the risk, continue to claim their rights as civil society organizations, as journalists, as human rights defenders, as professionals, as trade unions, as citizens. Those who continue to speak and will not be silenced. Our support must be practical, but above all, it has to be political in our lobbying for their rights. And we cannot pretend we can do business as usual. We need to increase the pressure on Turkish government to restore the rule of law and to respect human rights and the rights of civil society organizations. Thank you very much.
Annie, if you could come and join our panel, please. Thank you. Annie, you mentioned the appalling conditions that the workers at Istanbul airport are experiencing. Tell us why it's so important to be able to strike, to be able to protest.
I think the number of deaths speaks a language. And of course, there's a number of people who are harmed behind it. It's not necessary that workers die in huge construction sites. Olympic stadia in London have been built without workers dying. So I think we need to continue to protect the lives of these workers. But it's also other working conditions that we have to be able to raise. In the end, it's about human dignity. It's about the right of workers, but of all citizens, to be treated well and to be able to defend this human dignity if others are violating it. So I think that's the core of it. Why freedom of speech, freedom of press are so important, because human beings need this freedom to speak up if others are violating their rights.
Is it really possible to continue economic relations with Turkey as if nothing has happened?
As I said, I think we have to question that. This is in no way, and let me be very clear about that, an appeal to cut economic relations. On the contrary, international companies are under the UN guiding principles for business and human rights obliged to respect human rights and workers' rights when they do business anywhere in the world. So what I think we could do maybe more is hold these companies accountable and enter a dialogue with them, how they can protect human rights and how they can actually follow the human rights of and the trade union rights, workers' rights of the people who work for them in Turkey. The same goes for trade agreements. You may be aware that the customs union with Turkey has to be revised, renewed. It's indeed necessary, no question about that. But in the EESC, civil society organizations have been arguing that this cannot be just business for money making. We need to include in trade agreements the so-called sustainability chapters, that is, paragraphs, clear demands that labor standards, workers' rights, human rights, and environmental standards are being respected while trading and while producing products and services to be traded between Turkey and the EU. So my plea would be to link human rights to economic activity. And this is not a strange or wild idea. It's an acknowledged approach by the European Commission, by the UN, by other organizations. I think that could be a pressure.
Thank you for that, Annie. Abdullah, if I could just end on you very briefly, is Turkey a place that you feel that you could ever call home again, that you will ever return to when the dust settles? And hopefully life returns to normal?
Well, I am very much hoping for that, of course. It's my homeland. That's where I was born and raised and educated for some time. Yes, one day, and hopefully, I will go back. And I'm actually very much optimistic on that front, because the Turkey, as I know it, cannot sustain this kind of, massive scale human rights violation and conduct the business as usual, especially on the economic front. As you pointed out, there's increasing cost to leverage upgrading agreement or signing a new agreement on the economic and the trade front, linked to the improvement on the human rights record as well. So and when you look at the demographic composition of the Turkish society, it's very diverse, very dynamic as well, despite a huge pressure we are facing. So I don't think the Erdogan government can take it too far in the medium and the long run. Eventually, it has to go back to the normalcy. When that happens, and hopefully, I will go back.
Ladies and gentlemen, Annie van Wezel and Abdullah Bozkurt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special interview with Lindsay Snell. Lindsay is an American award-winning journalist who specialises in conflict in the Middle East and Africa. In 2016, she was imprisoned in Turkey for 2 months after being kidnapped in Syria by Al-Qaeda. In prison, she was treated as an enemy spy, while the Turkish press claim she was a CIA agent involved in the coup attempt. She has been covering the purge and has written several pieces on the crackdown in Turkey. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Lindsay Snell. Now, Lindsay, your story is quite incredible. Many journalists didn't... Can you hear me? Sorry. We can share this one.
Oh, you will have to.
Ladies and gentlemen, technology is not our friend today, honestly. It is, it's working now. Okay, there we go. Now, Lindsay, your story is fascinating because many journalists didn't go to Syria. Some couldn't get the paperwork, others didn't dare go because of the threat to life and limb. But yet you, as a journalist and a filmmaker, an American journalist and filmmaker, knew the dangers, and yet you still decided to go. Tell us why you went.
I went, I started to go at a time when it was a bit safer than it is now, or was in 2016 when I was ultimately kidnapped. But in 2014, the border between Turkey and Syria was still open, meaning the journalists could pass. There was a sort of vetting process. The Free Syrian Army had an office on the border, and they would screen who was ever picking up journalists and, the groups that journalists were embedding with. And it was a bit safer, obviously still not safe. The constant bombardment from the Assad regime was a threat, and kidnapping was a threat. But it was safer. And I went successfully, and I got the most compelling material I'd gotten in my entire career.
You were there to film the casualties after the airstrikes when they had hit hospitals, schools, marketplaces. Tell me about that. Tell me what you witnessed and filmed.
And not only the casualties of the bombardments, but the realities of life in Syria, where resources were very scarce. Schools were routinely bombarded, as were hospitals, marketplaces, civilian areas, while the military areas were largely untouched. So it was amazing to be able to show what was actually happening there, and to witness the horror of, you know, bombs falling at night and kids waking up out of their beds when a bomb hits nearby and crying, and then immediately falling back to sleep because they were so used to the bombardment. It's just such a reality of life there. So it seemed incredibly important to go, and it seemed as though I could go, and I did, you know, successfully go 7 times before anything truly bad happened. So.
Now, while you were filming the airstrikes, the Guardian newspaper printed an article saying that militants were hunting you. They were hot on your heels. They were going to catch you any day. What was it like being in Syria, knowing that all of this was ready to engulf you?
I mean, they had me at that point, so.
So they were a bit late with the story, were they? Yeah.
Well, it was murky, obviously, to anyone who wasn't in Syria, what was actually happening. According to Al-Nusra at the time, now called HTS, they were just investigating me because they'd heard that I was a CIA agent, which is something that they say about practically every foreign journalist that they've kidnapped, when in reality it's just a move to hold someone and get someone to pay a ransom for them. So I'd always known it was a possibility, and I sort of steeled myself for the possibility that it could be a couple of years of being in their custody.
So what happened? They abducted you. Where did they take you? What kind of experience did you have there?
Well, first they took me to sort of a prison safe house, I guess you would call it. And I saw a few of these actually in the Idlib countryside, in the western countryside of Aleppo, where it's sort of a house that they've repurposed with like a jail cell in the basement, 1 exit, 1 entrance, so guarded all the time and guarded by predominantly foreign Al-Qaeda members. I think that they trusted them more than the Syrians. Yeah, and I was in the first house for a week. I had what they called the Shura Council come to interview me and ask me questions about why I was in Syria, and they conceded that I had permission to actually be filming in Syria, but they said, you know, we think you might be a spy, so we're very sorry, but...
And it was obvious that you weren't the first person to be incarcerated, because tell me what was on the wall.
Oh, well, this was later. This was actually in a real prison that Al-Qaeda was using, where there were many other male prisoners. It was sort of built into the side of a mountain. It looked like it might have been a factory at a previous time, but it was now a prison. And there were hash marks on my wall and blood, which I guess, you know, denoted how long some other prisoner had been there.
Now, unbelievably, you managed to escape, and you managed to escape because you struck up a friendship with women that I'm assuming were wives of the militants. And you managed to convince one of them to allow you to use her mobile phone so you could tell the family back home that you were okay. She unbelievably gave you the mobile phone. Tell me what you used the mobile phone for and what the outcome was.
Well, excuse me. They allowed me to use the mobile phone. They thought they disabled everything, you know, all of the Wi-Fi and the apps, but in reality they hadn't done anything that I couldn't undo. So I made a Gmail account and contacted another Syrian friend of mine in Turkey who was able to put me in touch with someone from Aurora al-Sham, an allied faction, and he ultimately came and scoped out the area and made a plan of escape for me.
So you managed to escape and you made it to the Syrian-Turkish border, and you must have thought, I'm safe, I'm okay. But that wasn't the case. You were then detained by the Turkish government. Tell me what happened then.
After I'd escaped, I was still in Syria for a couple of days as I prepared to cross out and make my way to the border, which was, you know, going through more Al-Qaeda checkpoints. So I knew that they were probably looking for me, and I was very worried on that front. And so I obviously had access to a phone then. I was in touch with, you know, American officials who assured me that, you know, we've made a deal with Turkey. They're going to let you cross. There's no problem. Just tell us where you'll be going. And I told them my roundabout area, and they suggested a place. And I crossed out. And the moment I did, there were U.S. officials and Turkish officials on the border. The Turkish officials told the U.S. officials they had to leave. They told me to get in the back of their truck, and they were arresting me.
How much do you think that your nationality was a factor in your abduction? Because we know that there's lots of dual nationals and US citizens currently behind bars in Turkey. How much of a factor do you think it was? And do you think that US citizens and dual nationals are being used as bargaining chips?
It was the entire reason. And they said as much when they eventually released me. But bad coincidence that I happened to cross to Turkey the night of the coup attempt, or cross to Syria the night of the coup attempt. So the optics were bad, although I don't know why I would be trying to escape to Syria. It was the entire reason that I was imprisoned. And they said, you know, we think you might have something to do with the coup attempt. We think you're a CIA agent. And obviously a modicum of research into what I was doing, what I'd been doing in Syria previously would show that that wasn't the case. But they needed a bargaining chip. And it hasn't just been Americans, it's been Germans. And now there's an Austrian journalist behind bars. So it's...
Tell me about the high-profile case of Pastor Andrew Brunson, who was freed quite recently. What do you know about that case?
Oddly enough, I believe that the day that I was actually released was the day that he was arrested. And I don't know why, but as far as anyone knows, we were the only solely American citizens who were in prison. But it's not just him. I mean, there's a number of Turkish-American dual citizens, such as Serkan Golce, you know, a NASA physicist who's been in prison for more than 2 years now. The sole piece of evidence against him was that the police searched his parents' home and found a $1 bill. So,
and that was the evidence? That
was the evidence, and that remains the only evidence. And he was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. Recently, his appeal was successful in that it reduced his sentence to 5 years, but this is 5 years away from his family for no reason.
Let's talk about the lengthy prison sentences, because journalism has been rebranded as terrorism. And if it's proved that you belong to a terrorist organisation, it comes with a really lengthy jail sentence, 7.5 to 43 years in prison. It's incredible, isn't it?
And it's not even just 43.5. I mean, there have been a number of aggravated life sentences as well that have been upheld on appeal. You know, a murderer might get a 12-year sentence if it's brutal and in cold blood, but I just interviewed an exiled journalist, Severi Guven, in Germany now, who was sentenced to 22.5 years for a magazine cover depicting Erdogan in an unfavorable way. So it's insane.
When you were in prison, they believed that you were a CIA agent. And as you said, this is quite common. They believe that quite a few people are CIA agents. What kind of treatment did you have when you were in prison? Did you have access to translators, to legal counsel? Did you have clean clothing?
I had no clothing. I had the clothes that I had on my back when I escaped Al-Qaeda, which was, you know, the black niqab and the black burqa, and this was all that I had in prison. And I was placed in a cell, you know, ironically, with women who were accused of being Al-Qaeda members. And then later, an admitted ISIS member joined our cell. No translators allowed. They were absolutely certain until the point that I left that I spoke Turkish, which was laughable. I really didn't. And it was bad, but I have to say that, you know, as bad and horrific as it was, you know, in the dead of summer, the water would just switch off. Obviously no air conditioning or anything, just sun beating into the cell. I know that it must have been much worse for the Turkish prisoners who were held separately. There was a pregnant woman in my cell who gave birth to her child. The child was ill, the child would not breastfeed. They were feeding it sugar water with a plastic spoon, and it existed in like one ratty t-shirt. They refused to take it to the hospital because the Gendarme agents didn't feel like taking the mother to the hospital. So it's just horrific.
In the World Press Freedom Index, Turkey is now 157 out of 180, which is truly appalling. Did you ever imagine that being a journalist could be such a dangerous profession?
Yes, but only, you know, intellectually. I think everyone's always heard about whatever country is currently despotic and cracking down on freedom of expression. But, you know, as I guess a naive American journalist, I always felt there's a sort of inherent nobility that would protect me in a way. And I'm grateful in a way to have the reality in front of me that, no, it's not safe and you're not protected. It doesn't really matter who you are or where you're from. You'll have an easier time maybe, but no one's safe.
How has the experience that you've been through, the detention twice, how has that affected you and what you do today?
I think that the effects weren't immediately clear. I just tried to get on with my life, and I did. and continued to travel and continued to report. Obviously, I'm not going to go back to Syria and definitely not going back to Turkey, but it was fine until I was in Iraq for work in June, and apparently Turkey found out that I was in Iraq, and this was at the height of the, Andrew Brunson row. And Turkey tried to send a diffusion request through Interpol, which is like an informal detention request, detain her so we can extradite her, which I found out, which I discovered when I reapplied for a visa in September, which, made me realize that they're still, and maybe it's the reporting work I've done since, that's highly critical, obviously.
So what happens now? How do you get off that list? Is it possible to remove yourself or to take steps to make that happen?
It is, and I'm working on it. It's, it'll take months, but this is another situation where I'm fortunate as an American and as a journalist, because there are more than 500,000 people had their passports revoked or have travel bans in Turkey. And all of these exiled Turkish citizens who will be resettled and have, refugee status or asylum status, who will travel, could have Interpol detainers on them. And they won't know until they travel somewhere and they could be held. And if it's a country that's, wants to curry favor with Erdogan, then maybe they'll be extradited back to Turkey. So even in the rest of the world, they're not safe.
As an American journalist and filmmaker, what do you think the future holds for Turkey?
Nothing good. Nothing good in the immediate future. It'll definitely get worse. I think it'll get worse economically. That's already proving to be the case. And yeah, the freedom of expression is not changing anytime soon. There are no critical journalists at this point. Even when I was in prison and I had a consular visit, they told me that, yeah, as far as we know, there is not a single journalist operating in this country that doesn't let the government preview all of what they're writing. So,
how important is the role of the International Observatory and NGOs in general in raising awareness about human rights violations in Turkey?
It's incredibly important because it's not getting the media coverage that it should be. And because of the complexities of the coup attempt and the politics in Turkey, I think that, especially Western audiences aren't as aware and as cognizant of what's happening, because it's sort of hard to wrap your head around if you're not.
Okay. Lindsay Snell, we wish you well. Thank you for sharing your story. Ladies and gentlemen, Lindsay Snell. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we're now going to break for a coffee break, which is just behind us here. And if we could be back here in 15 minutes for our next session. Thank you.